we promise to answer all and any questions, any comments that you might have. Our schedule is 1 hour. If we have to, we'll stay here as long as it takes to finish off any questions that you might have. So for those of you just tuning in, my name is Christian. I'm founder and CEO of Engage Innovate, and this is the 6th webinar we have the pleasure and the privilege of hosting. One of the things that's important to us is developing new strategy tools, new and better, more efficient strategy tools for disruptive times. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about in our webinars and also in this webinar is something you can go online, you can download for free. So you'll find a suite of tools. Some of them we've been using for years, and we have some more sort of insight and experience with. Some are fairly new even to us. We also develop how-to books and guidebooks. We do have more videos and content coming, but please go online. You can download anything that you like. Also, just a quick comment here to those of you in the energy sector. If we have time today, we're going to introduce sort of a sneak preview to something related to the energy arena, the energy field. So, Adil, if you're still involved with some oil and gas at all, you might find that interesting. So that's something we're going to do just at the end today. Now, as I mentioned, please feel free to join the conversation. It's really interesting pleasure to have a two-way interaction here. Now, you do have the option of chatting only with me and Jolene, who's off camera right now. But we really urge you to open the chat to all panelists and attendees. So just check your setting on that when you're speaking. So a quick introduction to myself for those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet. So my name is Chris. I'm residing happily in Norway, but travel quite extensively. Hello, Guillermo. Nice to see you sign in. Welcome. So I'm traveling quite extensively to do strategy consulting, advisory services, both for small companies, big companies, and also increasingly government and government agencies. I also teach extensively at a business school, multiple business schools, currently developing a new master program on clean energy. And I'm also the main designer behind strategy tools. This is one of the tools that we will be presenting today. We are using the example of energy arena. You can replace that with any topic. That can be digital health, that can be smart city, that can be mobility. So don't focus so much on the domain, the industry domain. Focus more on how we use the tool. Now we have John signing in from Australia. Well, welcome there, mate. Thank you for joining. So what I hope that you will take away today are three things. Number one, we really want to help people and leaders understand how governments can accelerate national transformation. So we can talk about sort of governments creating a national innovation policy. We cannot take it 2 steps further from just the innovation side to really large-scale, massive, transformational innovation. And we call that accelerating national transformation. It's something that I've been working on both in Norway and also abroad for about 2 years now. Second, we want to introduce you to the term Innovation Superclusters, and more importantly, how to build them. We believe that this is a significant new contribution to the field of innovation. It's probably quite neglected in most bodies of literature and also most insights. And we're very passionate about pushing this understanding, this emerging understanding, which builds on research from Harvard, it builds on research from MIT, it builds on Norwegian innovation policies going back to 1992. It builds on international best practice for government-led innovation practices. But that's why we built these tools. So item number 3 that I hope you'll take away from today is really, yes, you can study the research, you can study the literature, but I really want to help you take a few quite simple tools and then apply them in whatever context you're in, whether that's in Australia, that's in Panama, or that's in the Middle East. Because I deeply, deeply believe, having seen this up front, that the right tools in the right setting can be incredibly powerful. We don't necessarily need more research. We need better tools to apply the research that we already have. So that's what I hope you guys will take away today. So let me begin with a story. I'd like to share with you a story from Canada. Now, as most of you know, Canada has the big wild outdoors, beautiful mountains for skiing, beautiful parks for hiking, and it is, by most accounts, a great country to live in. In Canada, you know, it has its relationship with its neighbor to the south, the US. It's a fairly thriving economy. Actually, a recent World Economic Forum ranking on overall competitiveness, so which are the most competitive countries in the world, Switzerland, Singapore, United States, they came out on top. And these are, you know, all three of them very recognized high productivity output countries. But Canada came in at a very, very decent 5.3 out of a 7-point scale, putting them basically number 12 on the rank. So in terms of government policies, industrial policies, and international competitiveness, Canada is doing fairly well. But there's one thing that some of you might be familiar with. I'm going to ask you a question. Does anybody know what this is? So here's a chance for you guys to chat away. Does anybody know what this is? It is, John, exactly. It's a yes, Andrea. It is a unicorn, and it's a funny one. Good, excellent. Some of you might be familiar with the unicorn. The unicorn is today a definition of a $1 billion value startup. So early stage, kind of fast or high growth company valued at 1 billion plus in market cap. Today we have right over 200 of these companies globally. They come from all over the world. They come from China, UK, South Africa, India, Germany, Singapore. But out of those 200, more than 50% originate from the US. So as a function of its innovation engine, the US has more than half the unicorns on the globe as of today. Canada has one. It used to have two, but one of them moved and relocated to San Francisco. So now they're left with one. Now the government of Canada looked at the map and they said, well, you know, wow, we're really falling behind. We are not in a position of competing internationally. We're not able to keep up with our peers. We need new thinking. They brought in a new Minister for Science and Innovation. And he brought in, let's call it a mindset, a government innovation mindset that was radically different from his peers previously. The Canadian government, a couple of years ago, started on what is now called the Canadian Innovation Supercluster program, Innovation for a Better Canada, which is a significant, and I can't stress this enough, it's a significant, huge national program, national undertaking, where the government will bring in almost 1 billion Canadian dollars, matched with funding from the private sector to unleash about close to 2 billion Canadian. But this Innovation Supercluster is not a national research program, which is often the case in a traditional triple helix model. It is a wide collaboration model of bringing university, government, startups, VCs together around industries for the future. So not just sustaining the current natural extraction, oil and gas being one of the leading industries in Canada, but really defining large funding, large collaboration around industry for the future. So a couple of weeks ago, Canada announced 5 national superclusters. One of them is the Canadian Ocean Supercluster, which kind of covers everything and anything at sea. Second is the Canadian Digital Technology Supercluster, which really is how do we develop a future fit, thriving industry around the digital side of Canada. And they also developed advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and protein food for the future clusters. So these 5 innovation superclusters are a large national undertaking with significant funding and significant ambitions. They're not just a small group of companies coming together and sort of collaborating. They're huge vehicles structured in a very specific way. And the topic of this webinar today is really about, so how do we do that? How do we replicate and learn from the Canadian model? Silicon Valley, it's known to most of us to be the innovation engine of the world. Today, it might be rivaled by Shenzhen and Shanghai and Beijing in China, but for the time being, it is really recognized. And it's a small place. In terms of square miles or square kilometers, it's not very big, but it has an incredibly high density of talent, venture capitalists, corporates, university, and government policies. And while Silicon Valley, as we know it today, has really emerged since the mid-1950s, we're also starting to find a lot of other superclusters having emerged by themselves over the years. Another one is in Boston, Boston Health Tech, or Boston MedTech, where, again, a high degree of density between corporates, startups, scale-ups, funding, VCs are intertwined both socially, meaning they go out and have drinks together all the time, or professionally, meaning they'll work together. And what's interesting about the Boston model is that while they usually have a lot of research programs and they have a lot of research tracks, they also have a lot of startup tracks and startup programs trying to blend them. Now this, what we're describing here in the US, is not really anything new. The concept, the simplistic concept of economic related geographies, meaning having similar companies working together by being close to each other, is well documented in economic theory and economic policies. But in fact, 20 years ago, Michael Porter at Harvard wrote Clusters and the New Economics of Competition, where he basically said a lot of competitors would actually benefit from collaborating because they can share resources, they can have access to IP, they can have access to new companies coming in, startups, they can have access to new educational programs. So if they recognize that, yes, we compete, but we can also collaborate, everyone would benefit of it. And few places do it as well as Israel. Israel, as many of you probably know, is recognized as the startup nation. It has an incredible output of patents, of startups, of scale-ups, of IPOs compared to the size of the country. And it has adjusted for headcount and how many people live there, by far the largest number of startups in the world. And again, studying these innovation hotspots, Silicon Valley, Boston, Israel, you really find some characteristics. Those characteristics is now the foundations for, okay, so how does the government not only observe this, but actually actively facilitate that? How does the government take a bigger role in shaping more powerful innovation engines for the future? So fast forward to Denmark. I don't know if any of you have been to Denmark. Do we have anyone from Denmark joining us today? Well, if not, we should. Denmark is doing some very interesting things. So a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, the Danish government put out a Danish drone strategy. This is kind of the national ambition document. It was not really a policy document. It was more of a, how can we take a national position, as a positioning document. And around that document, a natural test center and cluster emerged. Very much bottom up, very much emerging. It was a few guys reading the document, seeing the need, pulling some scrappy resources together. They were able to interact very positively with the government. And what you see on this slide is a 3-step test area for drones, drone projects, drone pilots, high risk, barely tested drones. And if you're fully familiar with the country of Denmark, you realize that they have a massive test area that is now regulated for the emerging drone cluster. And this kind of test center looks something like this. It's small, but they have been able to attract more than 300 companies, IBM, startups, international VCs, to kind of come around and come together around how do we build a emerging bottom-up cluster around drones. No one really has that in Europe yet. This Odense, small city in the middle of Denmark, might just have the opportunity right here, from a bottom-up perspective, to build a new cluster, possibly even a supercluster around drones. So this is happening. This kind of stuff is happening, but it's been happening for a while. Now, if we jump from Denmark to Norway, the Norwegian government, policymakers and policy shapers, they've been discussing what we today describe as clusters since early 1992. So previous governments, previous government advisors, interacting with Harvard, doing research projects with Harvard, interacting with BI, my business schools where I teach, more recently interacting with MIT. They've been able to do research and policy that allows us to understand how to build better clusters. So the Norwegian government, interestingly, is one of the premier examples of how do we build what we might call early stage or local clusters, but now looking at how do we scale it up to become a global supercluster. I'll give you one example of that. So this is a beautiful Norwegian scenic picture with fish farm. In the 1970s, Norway didn't have a fish farming industry worth speaking of. Fish were caught, a little bit of fish was raised, but it was really a non-existing industry for the fish farms back in the 1970s. Today, Norway is a global powerhouse when it comes to aquaculture and fish farming, but it's now facing several innovation challenges. Number one, the industry is becoming more sizable, more capex, more investment required. They're bringing in more large structures, moving from what we call inshore to offshore installations. It's becoming bigger, it's becoming more professional. It is also facing digital disruption. So something as basic, if you will, as fish farming and aquaculture is now facing the same driving forces, the same competitive forces that, let's say, media, television, film, camera have been facing. So even though it's an edible fish and a biological product, digital technologies is now actively shaping the fish farming industry. Now, we've learned the hard way, and many economies have learned the hard way, that incumbents, old big companies, aren't necessarily the best ones when it comes to handling industry shifts, when it comes to handling digital technologies, new business models. So what is always required is we need to bring in new perspective, new skills, new talent, new funding, new mindset, new people. Like this example, where you have a company called iFarm. The concept is called iFarm, which is basically individual facial recognition on every single fish. In this case, you see ID number 02468. We could give him a name and call him Bob. His gills are okay. There's no sea lice on him. His growth development versus plant development looks normal. And he is, by any account, a happy, thriving fish. Now, this is done by machine, automatically connected back to big computers and big data processing, giving us machine learning on how to optimize what's happening inside the cage. This is an example of something that doesn't exist today, but it's something that is developing, if you will, at the intersection between the aquaculture industry and digital technologies. Getting to this level of innovation requires big companies, it requires small companies, it requires new investors, it requires new talent, it requires education and learning, and many things that need to come together. Traditionally, those things have come together kind of a random, chaotic, bottom-up approach, but we're now looking at how can governments support this and build even stronger structures? How can governments facilitate this even stronger? And governments need to do this around future growth industries. It's one of the big challenges, but it's also very important for governments to not, in a global competitive environment, not hope for the best, but actively shape and invest in new growth industries, probably more actively than most governments are aware of. And that brings up a range of questions that's being brought up. So number one, how do we accelerate our national transformation as a government? What are the policies? What are the funding available? What are the tools and mechanisms that we can use? Now, as policy receivers, on the receiving end of this, it's like, okay, how do we build new innovation engines? Not a more innovative company, not a more innovative startup, but really the combination of forces. And we've been developing and testing and using Innovation Superclusters for future economies. So what is this? And I noticed Hillman had a question. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. So one of the things that we realize is that globally, the world is learning to innovate faster. And whether by default or by design, Innovation Superclusters are increasingly playing a very important role. Now, these really powerful superclusters, and I'll define them in more detail in just a minute, are really the global engines of innovation. They attract talent, capital, R&D investment, corporates, and combined, they create a very, very, very strong ecosystem. Countries and regions around the world, with the example of Denmark, which is a bottom-up, and the example of Canada, which is very much a top-down, are learning to actively grow these innovation superclusters on a massive scale. And there's no doubt that clusters drive future ecosystems. So what are they, and how can we define them? So we have three types of cluster. So the first type of cluster is what we call an emerging cluster. An emerging cluster is a potential growth cluster. It can cover and sort of be applicable across many sectors and industries. It's probably quite incomplete. It has certain building blocks, but not all the building blocks required. It might cover many different nationalities, meaning different people and contributing. And you can also have many of these emerging clusters within one country. So if you're in Canada, you can easily have 50, 60, 70 of these potential slowly emerging clusters. They are very local, meaning they're connected to local initiatives, local companies. And typically they kind of run on the 3-year horizon. That's kind of their lifespan. Larger, more impactful clusters are what we call the growth clusters, or the GCs. These are really high potential areas. They have strong shared value creation. So they have much higher value creation than comparable companies outside the cluster. They might be missing a few elements, meaning they might not have access to any startups. They might not have access to any private investors. But overall, they have the building blocks of a successful ecosystem. Any one country can have from 30 to maybe 10 of these. So if you look at a country like Norway, you can easily have like 10 to 15 growth clusters that over time as they develop might be able to compete globally. They also tend to supersede national borders. And this is important because it's very hard to define clusters only as a national innovation tool. They supersede. One example is the intersection between Denmark and Sweden around the Öresund region, where you have people working in Denmark, living in Sweden. You have people living in Denmark and working in Sweden. Students, companies going back and forth. It supersedes national boundaries. I suspect you'll find similar in Southeast Asia between Malaysia and Singapore. You'll find similar in the Middle East. So superseding national boundaries. Now the real juice, ladies and gentlemen, if you will, high impact, very large scale. It has a massive number of members, are superclusters. Superclusters are strong, powerful, recognized, very visible structures that can compete globally. They're recognized globally, like Tel Aviv in technology, like Shenzhen in technology hardware, like New York in London in finance and fintech, and Silicon Valley for technology. They have a very large share of export value, and they have a significant outperforming value creation versus other national companies in the same area, but outside of the cluster. So the cluster itself generates significant added value for its members. Any one country might sustain between 3 to 10 superclusters. Canada, as you might recall, had 5, which is probably more than enough for a country that size. And these superclusters can easily span multiple country borders. Now, they would typically take 10 years to develop. So there's a very long time development factor here. This is not something you do overnight on a piece of paper. It takes years to fully develop. Now, that's the 3 types of clusters. So I'm gonna just take a moment to answer some of those questions. And of course, there's more content coming in a minute. So Andrea asked, so superclusters are a platform for hosting and nurturing innovation ecosystems. Partially true. Innovation superclusters are really the size and the richness of those platforms and those ecosystems. So the emerging clusters, which you see on the screen here, can be very small. They're local by nature. They're very incomplete, meaning you might have a heavy research angle or a very heavy corporate angle, but you don't have what we're going to show you, the 5 key building blocks. Hillman asked a great question. Is a member an individual person or a company, government, agency, startup? Good question. So by member, we tend to mean organization. So one member would typically be one company. So if Microsoft is a member, they might bring hundreds of people into the mix, but Microsoft would be one member. If Google, they have about 65,000 employees, give or take. If Google is a member of a supercluster, they would count as one member, not as 65,000 members. And I'll show you a little bit more on that in just a minute. Florian has a great question. Do you mean clusters are government supported / initiated, or could they be 100% private initiative? That's a great question. They're usually a mix. Now, if you look at the Danish example that I showed, it's really a government policy that inspired a private bottom-up, and then they kind of connected. I suspect, but I haven't checked fully, that there's now some government funding, but that kind of started out as a initiated private, probably linking into government. You look at the Canadian example of the really building the Innovation Superclusters, that is 100% government-led, government financed, and they're now sort of kickstarting the private side. If you look at some of the examples that we've worked on in Asia or in Norway, it's government-led, but then it's triggering, unleashing, and inviting private enterprises to join. All right, so we have two more questions before we continue. So Richard is asking, traditionally clusters emerge from a conglomeration of capabilities and businesses, meaning geographically tight knot. Am I suggesting that this vision is out of date? Richard, no, it's good. So going back to what I mentioned about Michael Porter, he wrote this about 20 years ago, that clusters is now a new engine for competition and collaboration. What we propose is that we need to take this a few steps further, because most clusters have kind of emerged within a geography, but some of them might be very, very incomplete, meaning they are very strong on the research / corporate, or they're very focused on the education and startup. But we're trying to sort of build that together and expand it in the supercluster framework, and I'll show you more in just a second. Question here from Andrea as well. Superclusters are technology-driven or problem-solving oriented. What is the specific driver that makes them the right place to be problem-solving? Okay, that also depends, Andrea, whether it's government-led or private-led. Now, what I found interesting about the example from Denmark was that there was absolutely no geographical reason of why the city of Odense should be a drone cluster center. The city of Odense happened to have a more or less closed down airport, and local startup heroes basically said, wow, can we use this airport? Can we borrow this airport? And then they built it ground up. For the Canadian government, they really, really, really looked at what are some of the industry growth trends, what are some of these industries of the future, digital technologies, ocean space. So they were not technology driven nor problem solve oriented. They were really industry growth, market opportunity growth, business development growth, and then we build clusters around that. And I think my example from Asia a little bit later is going to explain that in a good way. Now, one thing that really separates superclusters from traditional clusters or naturally emerging, naturally developed clusters is that they tend to attract, they're very attractive. They are recognized as very attractive places to be for challenging work, for learning, for networking, for top jobs and salaries. So they tend to attract talent, funding from investors, and corporate setups. For instance, Intel, Microsoft, Google, It's just a handful of the companies that have significant research centers and recruiting centers in Israel and mostly Tel Aviv. So these superclusters are very often known globally. They have a high degree of value from exports, and they regularly compete and win on a global stage, not just a local national stage. Kind of what happens when you get into some of these superclusters is that they are really fast, powerful engines for growth. They are holistic, complete ecosystems. They have such a high degree of physical density, so that's going back to the geographics. And because of this kind of energy, they feed off themselves. They attract funding, they attract new startups, they attract more funding, they attract more talent, and you get into this positively reinforcing cycle. So four clusters that I'm quite familiar with. I haven't really worked that much with them, but I pay attention to them. I've had many conversations. So one is a smart city cluster. It's based here in Stavanger, Norway. A second is a solar energy, so an exclusive solar energy cluster in Norway. A third is a Norwegian smart care cluster, which is also based here in Stavanger, Norway. And the fourth is the Luxembourg government space cluster. Now, these four I've followed since early days, and it's been extremely interesting to see how they've been developing. What's the combination of top-down government initiated, what is kind of the bottom-up industry initiated, where they meet, where they're kind of missing pieces. And in every single example, there's always building blocks that are big, powerful drivers, and then there are building blocks that are absolutely missing. Now, the Canadian example is a powerful one, because when we talk about the high density and getting all the building blocks together, the picture might look like this. So this is one snapshot of the premium players in the Canadian artificial intelligence cluster. So you might remember that I mentioned that artificial intelligence, or AI, was one of the 5 superclusters defined in Canada. Well, this is one snapshot of what it looks like. Now, notice here that it has all the different cities coming together. It has Toronto, Waterloo, Edmonton, Vancouver, and Montreal. So it's not a city initiative. It has on the my upper right, they have the international players that comes into Canada. So it kind of supersedes the traditional national borders. Huawei from China, of course, IBM US, Intel US, Samsung from Korea, Ford from just across the border in Michigan. They also have, and if you look on my far left, startups. So those are, of course, young, early stage companies. They have incubators and accelerators and VCs. And look at how they placed the incubators, accelerators, and VCs kind of smack in the middle of this chart. They have research labs, and then they have large corporate companies coming in here. Now, this is one snapshot of a very early, very young industry. And I think the government in Canada has done a pretty impressive job of sort of mapping this out and trying to realize how does all these pieces fit together. Because you can look at AI, the focus on one company, one startup, or one corporate, but really looking at the complexity of these. Now, some of the building blocks that we know matter. There's a few. I think many of you might know this, but you need to have high density of different actors, companies, people. You need to have a fairly close physical proximity. You need to have a very strong network and collaboration culture, kind of innovating across traditional organizational boundaries. And you need to have a lot of knowledge sharing, transferring of people, moving people around, doing intern programs where people will be shifting from company to company, much like the bee will be flying from flower to flower with new ideas. You need to have a lot of socializing transferred across the superclusters. No silos, not too much firewalls, but getting that collaboration across the whole ecosystem. And it builds on this. So this is the foundation for one of the key tools. So what you see here is really a framework that's been developed originally from Harvard. Then it's been developed further from MIT. It's been developed further in terms of research from BI, the Norwegian Business School. And you have 5 major building blocks. The entrepreneur, meaning the startup founder, startup CEO, but this is really the startup company we're looking for. Capital, and capital usually means risk capital, private funding that comes not as a research grant, but it really comes as market-driven, expecting return, and what we call knowledge-driven capital. You have corporates, large companies like IBM, Microsoft, Google, Ford. You have the government with policies, taxation, and various incentive schemes. And you have the academics, the Stanfords, the MITs, the Harvards. Now, you pull these together. We really recommend putting the market in the middle. So what I'm going to show you here is one example of the tool as we develop it with a specific industry domain. So in this example, we're using the example of clean energy. And I think most governments around the world, whether that's Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Singapore, South Africa, or Canada, would like to have nationally, regionally, a supercluster for clean energy. So clean energy, you start with the market in the middle. Who are the market makers? Who are the customers? How do you get access to the customers? How do you get customers into the innovation process? How do you get customers to interact closely with the corporates, closely with research, closely with entrepreneurs? If you don't have that market-driven approach, the chance of supercluster success falls dramatically. Then we have the 5 building blocks here. The entrepreneur, capital, corporate, government, and academics. And then we zoom out. We combine all of this into our supercluster tool. This is a tool that any of you can download, print, PowerPoint. You can use it in your own work. You can use it in sales pitch if you're a consultant. You can use it with government representatives. You can use it with the king himself, if so be it. But it really creates powerful conversations around how can our government, how can our politicians create better innovation engines. I'm going to take you through sort of these 5. So the first I mentioned is the startup entrepreneur. So here are 5 questions. That's really powerful questions. 5 questions that are really worth pursuing for a government agency, government policy, government leaders. Some of these are what we call insight questions, and some of these are action policy questions. For instance, what are the top clean energy startups in the region? And we've seen regions that proclaim themselves to be clean energy clusters, and they can name one clean energy startup within their region. What are the biggest barriers to great entrepreneurship in our country? That talks about culture, it talks about incentives, talks about financing. How do we develop more entrepreneurs? How do we attract new foreign entrepreneurs? And how do we enable great entrepreneurs to really good ones to grow bigger, better, faster? So these are typical questions that we would be asking on the entrepreneurship track. On the capital side, and again, the example here is clean energy, but you can replace clean energy with any domain: smart city, digital health, automotive, drones. How do we provide funding for projects and startups? Who are the top angels, business angels, or early stage investors in our region? What do early stage investors really care about? And what are the biggest barriers to risk capital Now, there are, of course, other questions you can ask, but we found these questions to give a sort of good overview and insight and discussion on how do we attract and secure more funding and capital into our region. Corporate. Now, of course, there's a lot of stuff that we can discuss around corporate innovation. We like the question of what market opportunities do we see? Because if the corporates see and understand and realize the market opportunity, they will invest and develop for it. How do we understand it? How do corporates understand what is clean energy, or what is smart city, or what is automotive mobility? Who are the key corporates to involve and attract in our regional supercluster? Governments. How can the government do a better job of supporting clean energy initiatives in our country? Now, what is preventing clean energy strategy at a government level? Remember that the Danish drone strategy was quite influential in unleashing the initiative that happened in Denmark. And what are the key programs, network, and alliances for clean energy that already exist in our country? So these are questions that you might want to ask on the government side. Now, on the academic side, what are the leading academic experts and institutions for clean energy in our country? How do we involve academia differently for new R&D projects? What are the barriers to developing a global top 10 research university in this field? And how does universities and business schools educate new clean energy entrepreneurs, not just students for lifetime jobs, but clean energy entrepreneurs for the future? If you put the right group of people together, that might be you, that might be your colleagues, it might be your boss, but really a broad mix of different people. You want to have professors, you want to have some young punks, you want to have some actual investors, you want to have some government representatives. If you put the right people in the room, you facilitate this, you work on this, you're going to end up with something that looks something like this. Getting a lot of insights, getting a lot of discussion to start building a supercluster policy. Let me give you an example of that. So some of you might be familiar with a book called The Entrepreneurial State. It's written by a wonderful researcher, professor called Mariana Mazzucato. And she's done extensive research on the importance of government-led innovation. So while a lot of people look to Silicon Valley and say, yeah, but that's private money, it's private companies, what she shows, hence debunking public and private sector myths, is that most of the technologies that have enabled Silicon Valley to thrive comes out of government research, government funding, and government support. The other book, Blue Ocean Shift. Some of you might be familiar with Blue Ocean Strategy by Kim and Mobon. They recently put out a second book, or a new book, called The Blue Ocean Shift, where they actually look at what we now call superclusters on a country level, trying to understand how does countries develop blue ocean strategies just like companies do. But those two books shaped the next and the final chapter of our webinar. So late last year, we were working extensively with government representatives, government agency in Malaysia. And in that work, the government side came up with 5 what they call market opportunities. How can Malaysia create and build markets around digital health, smart city, agrotech, that's in smart farming, mobility, and clean energy? So our initial work, and the kind of the work that we can share with you, became a Malaysian Innovation Supercluster report that is freely available online. It's been published and it can be shared. And it gives a high-level picture to the early steps made by the Malaysian government. Now, what was really powerful, what was really interesting, and this is where the tools come to life. So we ran several engagement sessions in Malaysia, bringing together industry experts, startups, students, private investors, government representatives. And the tool that we've been presenting were printed out, large scale, and put to work. And this picture, you see a gentleman sitting with a pen. He is from Petronas, so he's an engineer, oil and gas. The lady on the far right came from a utility company, but really from the innovation arm of the utility company. One of the gentlemen in the back is a government representative. The gentleman on the far left, in a gray coat, is a private entrepreneur with extensive experience, and so on and so forth. This became one of many, many, many powerful dialogues around clean energy, smart city, digital health, agrotech, and smart mobility. And over the course of hours, and really, really intense deep dive, we gained, and I believe the participants gained, and our government contacts gained, immense insight into various understandings and various building blocks on how do we sort of pull together and build innovation superclusters. So what you're seeing here is that we have different groups, and the question from Andrea is that each table with a different topic. Well, partially, so we had probably 4 or 5 tables with the same topic. So let's say 5 tables on smart city, 5 tables on clean energy, and then maybe 5 tables on agrotech. And then we would rotate. And those of you familiar with the format of the World Cafe, we would rotate, we would do a quick debrief, and then continue to add on and add on and add on. And we do many, many iterations. Probably in this picture, you have close to 60 or 70 people in the room, and they were all cycling and recycling and interacting in a real mashup format. And then we run this across different topics. As time wears on, you see a number of things emerging. And upon completing this, we were very fortunate and kind of privileged that the Malaysian Prime Minister on stage announced the creation of Malaysian Innovation Superclusters. This is extremely early stage. It's extremely early for the supercluster understanding in Malaysia, but we're just getting started. I'm going to show you just a few snapshots of what we found though. So some of the key issues that emerged was we need to work across silos, we need to build smarter partnerships, and we need to get better access to markets, customers, and funding. Of the participants that we worked with, it was very, very obvious that smart city and mobility were the most powerful market opportunities, while digital health was by far the most challenging in terms of market opportunities. Clean energy became a very, very interesting discussion where they realized they had many of the building blocks, but significant gaps in terms of getting that whole picture. So when we looked at Malaysia, we saw that there were big strengths in terms of government and corporate, and then there were big weaknesses, structural deficit weaknesses around the entrepreneur, access to capital, and partially also the economics. Now, what this means for corporates is that we're moving from a traditionally closed business model to a much more open source, much more collaborative, much more open innovation driven. And some of the things that emerge, companies need to get better at networking, being comfortable working outside their own traditional sphere and their own traditional value chain. Companies do need to set up their own corporate innovation labs. On the entrepreneur and the startup side, it became obvious that Malaysia should invest in venture building programs for new startups and need to improve the access to early risk capital. But really, the big takeaway was the need to have much wider collaboration versus traditional silos, and also understand the market opportunities. So that work in Malaysia is really just getting started, and I think it's going to be years until we see the full fruit and the full impact. But we've had multiple very, very powerful engagements with representatives from government, finance, startups, and corporates in Malaysia. So getting close to wrapping up here, I'm going to give you some of the tools that we've touched on. Now, all of these tools are available at strategytools.io. You can go on, download. You'll find different formats. You'll find different kind of setups. But growing a successful innovation ecosystem, that's number one. That is the Supercluster tool, par none. The second, which is kind of the next step, that can be done in the same workshop format and can be done in the later workshop format, is the Supercluster fundamentals. That is basically, okay, now we understand what a supercluster is. We understand these 5 premium building blocks. So how do we design it? Let's say we are in Australia. And how do we design it? What are the things that matters to the participants? What are the things that we need to sort of bring in to make this successful? Access to customers, access to technologies, new startups, new public funding, research grants. What are the items that matters? How should a supercluster be designed to be relevant to us? Then maybe less of a tool, but we find them very important to use, is the definition and typology of clusters. So we have the emerging cluster, the growth cluster, and the supercluster. And then we have the key building blocks for an innovation supercluster. Now, all of these tools are available online. You can grab them in JPEG, PDF, using your slides, printing out in large or big tools. We are developing software, but they're available for you today if you would like them. The 2 most important tools, and hopefully you'll find it interesting enough to sort of play around with, is probably this Innovation Supercluster tool and the Supercluster fundamentals. Those 2 we have used with very, very good success. We don't need necessarily a lot of government policies, but we need to get government and industry to come together and discuss and work on this. So just wrapping up, and I notice we are just on time here. If you would like to know more, you can always read some of the books that I recommended. But if you'd like to get started, we are extremely passionate. So if you would like to get started, I would just urge you to invite us. Let's have a conversation. Let's have a dialogue. We can work remotely, or we can work on site. We are now just starting work on 2 new cluster projects that we hope to scope up to grow into superclusters. So we're really, really passionate about going anywhere and kind of engaging and working on this. If you do want to do this yourself, there are 4 ways. There are 4 ways that you can get started on building and scaling superclusters. And this is going to be my very last content slide before we wrap up today. Yes, we are going to do all the questions. Number 1, do existing research on pre-existing clusters. And what that means is your government or your university business school can actually go out and map economic clusters that exist today. You'll probably find that they are local, they're not fully developed, but every country and every regional economy will have naturally emerged pre-existing clusters. They already exist. Just go research them. Or you can have the ambassador. Now, the ambassador is really a superhero deluxe. It's usually a lone project manager with but very limited resources. He or she is able to inspire, activate, connect, network, plan, and lead. Is not really able to do any significant content work. It is much a cheerleader, a networker, an initiator. Now, this can be very challenging over time, but we've seen some amazing growth clusters emerge out of the ambassador. Now, what the Canadian government did, of course, was a very top-down government policy. We have close to 1 billion Canadian. We're going to choose 5 superclusters. Let's go find them. Very much top-down. While top-down facilitation and bottom-up engagement is the example of the Danish drone cluster that is now emerging, where you have a combination of forces from bottom-up and top-down. I've seen all of these work. I've seen all of these have really powerful usage in different parts of the world. Some places, it's good to start with research and then go into the government policy. In other areas, it's really good to start with an ambassador and then go into the bottom-up ecosystem. But we've seen all of these approaches work. So, concluding notes. I'm going to also take all the questions here. We have seen a shift in how the world understands innovation. And what we're seeing is that the government, using the right tools and techniques and research and understanding, they can really, really do a more hands-on, more powerful job in developing superclusters rather than just having a hands-off, laissez-faire economic policy approach. For Norway, for example, there are now multiple cluster projects where the government is more aggressively trying to move them up into supercluster status. It's very challenging. While in other parts of the world, the government has an extremely hands-off approach, basically letting them blossom up and emerge by themselves. So while we believe in free markets and we believe in capitalism at its finest, we do believe that governments can take a much more powerful role when it comes to accelerating national transformation. And we believe that Innovation Superclusters can be the main driver for government-led innovation. So I hope that's been useful. I am going to stick around and answer all of your questions, but if you want to leave, then we're going to say thank you for joining. I think the most important thing is get started, get going, by research, by ambassador, by top-down or bottom-up. And I would also love it if you guys, when we send out the survey, would respond to your survey with a few questions. So let me dive into the questions. Jolene, I see we have a good number of questions. And guys, any questions will stay around here. We'll start with Richard. So Richard has some insight here. All the evidence I have seen suggests that governments cannot decide to have a cluster in X being fintech, at location Y being Manchester, although they often spend money to attempt it. That's correct. What they can do is nurture, support, and strengthen existing and emerging clusters. Would you agree? To a certain extent, yes. We do, however, believe that the government can build maybe not X cluster in Y location, but the government can probably have a much more hands-on, a much more stronger approach than we would traditionally be expecting. And I think what we found on the top-down government policy is if they do it right, if they connect with what we call future growth industries, they tap into local ecosystem, just like you're saying, Richard, just like you're saying, and they're able to connect those two worlds, then that's the most powerful recipe. And what the Canadian government did, and that has been doing really well, was that they said, we want to develop innovation superclusters, but you have to tell us which topics, which locations, which themes, and then you have to compete for them, because we're not going to do all of them. But the top-down government policy needs to tap into the local resources. Richard, do you have follow-up questions? Will the slides for the presentation be available? Absolutely. We will be emailing you just as soon as we sort of wrap up and get this processed. So you'll have all the slides and the video on YouTube later today. All right, so we have a question here from Florian. So when we run the workshop, and we showed you a few photos from one of the workshops in Malaysia, it's like we do use a lot of the principles from the World Cafe. And if you're experienced with the World Cafe, you would recognize kind of what we do. It's just simply a matter of getting engagement and getting input, getting people to work, rather putting a lot of smart people in the room and having them sit and listen. So we use the principle behind the World Cafe frequently. Then we have a question from Andrea in Italy. In order to select the market topics, there has been a customer development problem exploration activity, lean startups that. Yes, but not always. So the Norwegian solar industry, a problem as many of you probably know, Norway doesn't have a lot of sun, although we do right now. It was really an ambassador said, I'm so passionate about the need for us to develop a solar industry. So even though we don't really have a solar industry, I want to build one, and I want to be leading the charge in collaboration with the existing companies to build a solar cluster. And what she found was that, wow, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of interest, there's a growing number of startups, there's a growing number of corporates. Wow, there are much more of the building blocks, including investors, than I was expecting. So by being the ambassador, she tapped into the bottom of engagement. And now they're sort of pushing for more government support and more government funding. In other areas, you can use more of the market exploration to identify what are the key growth sectors, what are the key growth industries that we should be looking at. All right, then we have John. Where do citizen activists and community associations fit into your cluster model? That's a good question. It's not explicitly in there. We would usually sort of put that at the intersection between the startups and government. So you could argue that they belong to the startups, early stage growth initiatives. We also place accelerators, incubators, innovation hubs, those sort of organizations along with the startups. Then we have Scott Carson. Hello, Scott. I don't think we've met yet. Thank you for asking the question. What is your view, Scott is asking, on government using foresight to inform its prioritization of investment in clusters? Now, I think sort of the foresight methodology is extremely relevant, Scott. I've seen many good examples in Asia of the government applying foresight, kind of long-range forecasting, long-range planning methodologies to try to prioritize investments in new superclusters versus investing in the clusters that are paying off today. So if the government representatives or the government offices are comfortable using different foresight tools, then absolutely it's highly relevant. All right, let's see. I think we're just about getting to the end of the questions. I'm going to double check that we haven't left anyone out. All right, we have one here that I missed previously. This is a question from Hillman. And Hillman, I don't know if you're still here, but I'd like to answer it. The question was, how does a cluster work in terms of responsibilities? Like, how do the members connect with each other? How is collaboration guaranteed among companies that are usually competitors? And then he commented on his own question, but I think these charts are answering that already. Thanks. Now, so any cluster will have a cluster management. I didn't touch on that specifically, but there will always be either a cluster CEO, a cluster office, a cluster governance structure. Some use the phrase industry-led initiatives or government/industry-led. So there are a organization body of some size. Usually it's a very slim, few people, little funding, little support, but there's some sort of organization body behind it. And then how is information shared and collaboration guaranteed? Well, I think most of you would recognize that collaboration is never guaranteed, but combining the professional collaboration and the relational collaboration, most members of any cluster realize that we can get more value out of this by collaborating versus competing. Now, it does take leadership, it does take communication and buy-in, but the basic principle is it would be smarter for us to collaborate, sharing IP, sharing talent, or just simply sharing problems and solutions, because it would allow us higher value creation on a global market. All right, so I think we have 3 quick questions again. All right, last from John here. Have you applied the 6 capital accounting audit model to developing cluster? John, I have not. I might be, but I'm not just off the top of my hand familiar with the 6 capital accounting and audit model. But I'd be happy to have a look in them. We can easily have a discussion on that afterwards. Right. So regarding Andrea's questions, in the UK SBRI program, are you, sorry, Jim?
Read 2 more.
Okay.
There are cases.
Yeah. So Scott has a question comment really on Andrea's question. In the UK SBRI program, in the US SBIR programs are examples of this. Good. Let me see. Yes, Florian, here we are. Where would you put research centers? Usually one of the key stakeholders. True. We usually put research centers by universities or academia. So if I go back to we would put research centers into the academics. Now, you can argue that it's not the traditional academics. It might even be a private research institute, but it would be usually in the category of the academics. And then we have, okay, so Andreas asks, there are cases where public sector becomes a market demand-led. Yeah, so this is what Scott mentioned about the example from Mazzucato's book. We don't see government markets as being fully developed markets. Public sector can be a significant shaper of markets, creating markets, but it's usually insignificant or insufficient to become a long-term sustainable market strong enough to sustain a cluster. If I were to use the Norwegian example, there's a lot of local government, local hospitals procuring new health solutions, but it's a very one-sided market with very sort of strong procurement processes and strong procurement formalities. So the market mechanics and the market size isn't strong enough to really support the growth of a very strong cluster. So we're just about to wrap up. We're about 15 minutes over time, and I really appreciate having these questions and conversations. So we have an input here from John again. 6 capitals is natural resources, human resources, social and relationship resources, intellectual property, manufactured, and financial resources. I'm familiar with some of the work happening around 6 capitals, but I'll look into this more. It's always interesting when we get stuff that we haven't looked at, connecting more dots. All right, so if any of you would like to continue this conversation, please do so. Email us. Let's set up a Skype. Let's have a conversation online, offline. I hope you've been enjoying these webinars. We are planning a few more in. So I'm sorry. So Hillman is actually Julia. Well, Julia, thank you. Now we know what the J is for. So Julia Hillman, thanks for webinar discussion. Interesting. No, I would love if there's any kind of way that we could connect more of these ideas into a German context. We do travel and present this work quite a lot. We don't have Germany on our travel map right now, but let's continue this conversation online, offline. I do hope you enjoyed the tools. This is very much work in progress for us. We haven't solved much yet. We have lots more to do. We will be lining up 3 new webinars in the coming weeks. We're still doing market testing on which topics you would like. So in the survey that we will email you shortly, I would really appreciate your input on new topics for our webinars. Thank you for joining. I'll be very happy to stay in touch. My name is Chris. We have Jolene off camera, and I wish you a wonderful evening, morning, or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Take care, and let's build better Innovation Supercluster.